Cool. Shall we start? And whoever joins starts. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool.
As people join, we can introduce ourselves a little bit later on too, in case there are people dropping in later.
Nice. Okay. Cool. Well, yes, welcome everyone to our first History of Everyone Else Facebook Live. Bear with us, this is our first one, so it's also kind of a test to see what works, what doesn't work. But anyway, my name is Rhianna, this is Meera. And yeah, we just created this platform a few weeks ago because both of us are on furlough, both of us are interested in history, and we have time to start to learn the parts of history that we really didn't learn at school. I'm Rhianna. I study a master's at Goldsmiths University in playwriting, and I also studied Black British literature last year. And then, yeah, Meera.
Yeah, I'm Meera. I am doing a master's in gender studies at the LSE, focusing on kind of gender development and globalization. But just like Rhianna, kind of have always loved history, and we actually met at university together studying politics. So yeah, very much a shared passion for both of us.
Yeah, cool. And then I guess I can talk a little bit about like how this works. So basically, we want to caveat that we are not experts in these parts of history. The point is that we never learned them, even though they seem really relevant to our lives in Britain, British history. So what we thought we would do is kind of pick something that sounds interesting that we don't know anything about, and just use the internet basically to research, to see what we can learn about it, and then share with you on the internet what we've learned and what we found out. So Meera, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah. I'm somebody who learns much better when somebody kind of talks me through something. So, I love learning about what Rhianna's just learned about in her course. I love when she shares that with me. I learn much better from that than reading an article. So and I like sharing what I know too. So for me, it's also a really nice kind of opportunity to be able to share what I've learned, and kind of make it feel easy for everybody else to go ahead and learn something that they didn't know about either. You don't need to be a specialist, an academic prof, to kind of learn about these things.
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, as people may have seen, our theme of this week is who were the Maroons of Jamaica. So I can talk a little bit about why we picked this particular topic. Essentially, with everything that has happened in the last month with Black Lives Matter, and just obviously for myself being of Jamaican heritage, like, hi mum, if she's watching. Then I was looking at the Black Cultural Archives website, and they have like really amazing subject guides that we can post later, talking about just the history of different aspects of Black history. And they have one on enslavement. So I was like, okay, let me read a bit more about enslavement and the history of it. And I came across like one paragraph that mentioned the Maroons, and mentioned that in Jamaica, the Maroons were people who created free societies, free communities in Jamaica over 100 years before slavery actually was abolished. And I was just like, why have I never heard of this group of people? This sounds really interesting, but even the subject guide only had a few sentences. So basically, me and Meera have just been like really reading everything we can about the Maroons. And now we want to tell you, what's the situation? Is there anything else, Meera, to say?
No, I just thought, we're going to spend about 10-15 minutes kind of just talking you through the story of the Maroons. We've divided it up into little chapters. So, Rhianna knows more about certain bits than I do. So I'm also kind of learning what she knows, and vice versa. And then we thought we'd spend about 10 minutes at the end kind of discussing what it made us think about how we are taught history, what it tells us about the history of everyone else, what this story kind of can make us think about. Okay. So and throughout, keep commenting. If you've got any questions, ask us. Quick shout out to Charlotte, Nina, Farah, Carl. Morning. So happy you guys are here, and hope you enjoy.
Yeah, and yeah, caveat, like we said, have been learning this for a week, so please do not like come for us if we make mistakes, but we are trying. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is just set the scene, so that we know a bit about what was happening in the island of Jamaica before we go deeper into what the story of the Maroons are. So one thing that really interests me in my research is learning about the Taino people, who were actually the people living on the island of Jamaica for over 700 years before any European discovered the island. So yeah, these were indigenous people to the island. They were living there, and obviously Christopher Columbus arrived, and in 1494, he arrived on a place called Discovery Bay, where I have actually been, and people were like, oh yeah, this is where Columbus like discovered yeah, the country. But yeah, so Columbus came there, and yeah, at this time there's about 60,000 people living on the island, and the people there call the island Jamaica. I don't know how to spell it, but it starts with an X. So yeah, that's where the word Jamaica comes from eventually. Columbus facilitates the Spanish taking over the island. And basically for the next 100 or so years, the Spanish use it as just like a military base. They also bring all of their diseases. And basically with the Europeans with the Spanish arriving on the island, most of the Taino people are pretty much wiped out, which kind of reading that during this time, thinking about what it means to be so afraid of pandemic and illness, and just we've been trying to put ourselves in the mindset of what that actually looks like, that 60,000 people almost who were either enslaved and eventually killed by disease. But yeah, so the Spanish are running this island, and it's not that profitable. They thought there was gold on the island. There isn't gold. So they're mostly using it as just their base to like sit there and take over other islands, look at their place, Cuba, on the other side. So yeah, that's what's happening. And then in 1655, the British have already started seeing what the Spanish are doing, and they want in. So they come in, and they essentially start a battle with the Spanish government. So they arrive on the island of Jamaica now, and they say, we want this island, and try and take it. I don't know, Meera, if you want to take on from this about
yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's really useful. And I like that you started with the Taino people, because what surprised me about learning about the Maroons was that I thought, when I read kind of communities of runaway enslaved people, that's what I imagined. But actually, these communities were made up of the groups of indigenous people and groups of runaway enslaved people who joined together and then kind of defended their communities in the mountainous, hilly areas of Jamaica. And so there are Maroon communities all over the Caribbean islands that are actually all culturally very different. Like it's an extremely like heterogeneous group of communities, because it's always been a mix of course, enslaved people come from different African countries, and then different indigenous communities as well.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I just I think there's a language that they kind of created together, the enslaved people who eventually take Africans, and yeah, the indigenous people. But anyway.
Yeah. And then but today we're just, because there's such a lot to say, we're going to focus on the ones in Jamaica, because it's the most relevant for kind of British colonial history. And so chapter 2 kind of starts, like Rhianna said, when the British decide to invade and conquer the Caribbean. And at that point, a vast number of the enslaved people under the Spanish colonists decided to run away and join the existing Maroon communities. And so their numbers grew. And I think it's important to say that this wasn't a simple story of kind of enslaved people and colonists, Spanish and British, versus everybody else. There were years when actually Maroon communities were in allegiance with the Spanish, fighting the British. There were years when Maroon communities fought each other. So it's never a simple story of kind of the powerful versus the oppressed, and it never is when you learn these histories. But yeah, so then their numbers grew, and two main communities really grew and started to thrive. On the west side of the Jamaican island were the Leeward Maroons, and on the east side were the Windward Maroons. The Leeward were led by Cujo, you may have heard of, and the east side, the Windward Maroons, were led by Granny Nanny, who I want to spend a moment on because I was so interested to learn about this leader. She was known for her exceptional leadership skills, her fierce guerrilla tactics, her signature move was dressing up as a tree and camouflaging herself to plan these ambushes. And she was kind of so formidable. She's gone down in Jamaican history and Jamaican heritage as just somebody who played a fundamental role in undermining institutionalized slavery. And naturally, I was surprised to read of this female leader. It's not what you expect. And her face is actually on the 500 Jamaican dollar note. That is the kind of pride that the Jamaican people have in Granny Nanny. And so she's well worth looking up and learning more about. Now, these settlements are growing, they're doing very well, but they're a constant thorn in the side of the British, because the British are trying to, make as much money as they can off their sugar plantations. And they've got these groups of Maroons constantly challenging them, constantly fighting them, constantly just being such a pain, that at one point the British decide to try to defeat the Maroons completely. And they launch a war against them. But, they're highly organized. They're led by people like Cujo and Nanny. And by 1740, the British realize they can't win. And they are actually made to sign these extraordinary treaties with the Maroon people. In 1739 and in 1740, the British actually had to sign treaties that gave them their freedom, their ability to govern, and most importantly, their land, ownership of the land that they were living on. And the issue of land redistribution is just fascinating. When you think about anti-colonial movements, you think about a fight to regain control over your land, right? That is kind of at the heart of the liberation project. But I think it should make us think about who is owning land today. I mean, my brother Ali Khan, who I think is on here, one of his favorite things he likes to tell me is that, who owns England? Who owns the majority of the land in the UK? It's actually a handful of individuals and families that have owned it forever. That's never really changed. And I know kind of one of the key reasons why South Africa is still such an unequal and stratified society is because at the end of apartheid, there wasn't a substantial redistribution of land. So yeah, I think thinking about land, especially also from a gendered perspective, where land is in so many societies can only be inherited by men, I think is really interesting. And so yeah, I think the role that the Maroons played in kind of undermining institutionalized slavery is super historical, but the terms under which they agreed it are really interesting. So do you want to take over there?
Yeah, and I think to just in case it's not clear basically what the British did when they arrived, whilst these Maroon communities are being created around the center of the island in the mountains, the Britain are ramping up their slave plantations. And plantations is a weird word because it actually sounds quite nice, but actually these are places of pure terror. Obviously, the British have been over the 80 years since they've arrived, building these plantations, creating sugar. And this is one thing that annoys me so much is a lot of it, when you read kind of the stuff about slavery and Britain in this time, it's all oh, well, Britain, they really developed their sweet tooth in the 18th century, in the 17th century. And it's for millions of people from Africa were being imported, killed, brutalized, working on these plantations, often to create sugar that went into the cafes and the restaurants and the bars and the pubs that are in Britain. So anyway, so this is happening. The weird thing about the treaty that Meera said, so basically imagine this scene, which did actually happen. Cujo, this a massively respected military leader of the Maroons, meets with the British. and they agree on the terms of to create peace. And what Cujo agrees is that in return for the land mentioned by Meera, in return for not have any taxes, and for being basically left alone by the British so that they can live and be free Black people in Jamaica, they also agree to send back any runaway slaves that they find. So essentially, they say, we ran away from the plantations, we became safe and we became free, but in the terms of this treaty, we will, if we find anyone else trying to leave, we will, send them back to your plantations. Also, they agree that if Britain is invaded, if Jamaica is invaded, the Maroons will fight on behalf of the British. The British are still scared of Spain. Spain is like looking at them from Cuba. So they're like, we will fight on behalf of you. And so there's some language in the literature saying that the Maroons, it was really divided. Some Maroon people were obviously really annoyed about this, or continued to help enslaved people to escape and to join them. But some Maroons also really allied with the British. That was seen as providing them with their safety, and became sort of a de facto police force for the British, which on the island. And so that's just something that came up that we weren't expecting to find out. Anyway, let me just have some water. So we've got this treaty, and in 1740, everything is slightly more peaceful in terms of the Maroons and the British, but obviously the British are still doing all of their enslavement, all of their disgusting things that they were doing on the island. For the next 80 years, there's actually, quite interestingly, you can read about how the Maroons and the British, there was moments of socializing, there was moments of this alliance. The other term of the treaty was that one white British man had to live in every Maroon community. And so for the next kind of 50 or 60 years, there have been English people kind of living in the communities with these Maroon people. However, by the time we get to about 1790, there's a new governor in town. He's British, he's taken over Jamaica, and he's like, what are these people doing in the mountains? I don't want them here. And increasingly the Maroons, they're still causing trouble. They're going to the plantations, they're doing ambushes, they are helping enslaved people. And so this governor is like, I want them gone. We need to defeat them. Then the English people who have been living with some of these Maroons, who have been developing these relationships, are saying to this governor, let it be in peace. Let's negotiate. Don't go heavy. This governor is like, no, I'm going to do it. So it seems like for the next few years, there's what they call a second Maroon War, in which the British and the Maroons start fighting again. And for 8 months, there's just a lot of fighting, but no one can really win, because once again, the Maroons are just really good at fighting. They know the land, they know how to deal with it. The British are they have more people, but they just can't do it. So in 1795, there's a second kind of negotiation process with the governor and the leaders of the Maroons. And the governor says, okay, if you surrender, I'll let you be, if you surrender. So the Maroons surrender, they put down their weapons, they say, okay, we'll live in peace again. But the governor was lying. And what the governor actually did is deport them. So once he had found a place of strength to say, yes, you have surrendered, he actually said, you didn't surrender fast enough according to the terms of this negotiation, so I'm deporting you. And so that sees 600 of these people, Maroon people, being deported, firstly to Canada, to Nova Scotia, where, and this maybe is another history of everyone else, I don't think we can go deep in it, but it seems like Nova Scotia is kind of a place for free Black people to be deported to, from both North America, from Jamaica. People were sent to Nova Scotia. I read that, so you can imagine there's these 600 Maroons, they know their history, they're so proud of their history, they're fighting people, and they've been sent to this place that they've never heard of, that they don't want to go to in Canada. They basically hate it. And actually there is, whilst these people have arrived in Canada, they start petitioning the British government, and they say, we don't want to be here. And so the British government are like, okay, we'll move you again. So these Maroon people end up being relocated to Sierra Leone. And we might do another session on Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone is essentially Freetown, the city, was where freed slaves were sent by the British to kind of go back to Africa, the problem to leave again. So, and that leads to all sorts of history in Sierra Leone. So, yeah, I think we just wanted to highlight that this kind of strange deportation, negotiation, lies of the governor. Anyway, so this happens. The final chapter of our research is kind of coming up to the end, the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, and this is called the Baptist War. So the Maroons have kind of been depleted a bit. They're still living there. There's communities of Maroons and they're just living their lives. You know, some people have been deported, etc. But rebellions can't stop happening. And I think one thing that we wanted to say is like, the thing of the Maroons, even if they were living separately, even if they're sometimes aligning with the British, they're still inspirational. So for people who are enslaved, they know that it's possible to be free. They know that maybe members of their family or maybe somebody that they knew managed to get out and is now living free with the Maroons. And so, yeah, also rebellions are happening. And on around Christmas Day of 1831, a man called Sam Sharp starts a kind of rebellion. He encourages enslaved people to start striking, and it leads to just like an island-wide rebellion. In today's money, almost 52 million pounds of property was burned to the ground. Like, the enslaved people really rose up. Interestingly, once again, you can find evidence of the Maroons fighting and crushing the rebellion on the side of the British, as well as Maroons supporting the rebellion. Or sometimes you see language like, the British told the Maroons to come and crush this rebellion, but the Maroons arrived like 3 days late and were kind of like, oh, sorry, they're too strong, they're too strong. So you don't really know whether they were deliberately, obviously, trying to allow this rebellion to go at the same time as trying to work on the side of the British. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of where we want to end. There's honestly, you can see that there's so much to say, but I hope that's given a bit of glimpse. And a few years later, abolition was passed by the UK. Largely, I think, because there were some English missionaries who who were living in Jamaica and stood on the side of the rebels. And then they also got tarred and feathered and punished extremely. These English people who were speaking on the side of the Jamaican enslaved people, they were punished in such gruesome ways, feathers and tar put onto their skin, feathers all over. And so they went back to England and said, look at what these white slave owners are doing even to us English people. And that led to a lot of sympathy and outrage in England. Because I was kind of like, how can England suddenly get really outraged now after 200 years of doing this kind of business? But then I read, okay, really, it was these English missionaries who came back and was like, we don't like what we saw. And then we also got tarred and feathered. And yeah, don't Google it, it's pretty gross. But yeah, that's where we can stop for now. Yeah.
And for those, I think I'm loving some of the comments that people are writing, like Nina writing, can you imagine being sent to Canada from Jamaica, which really
I read somewhere that it's like they were like, yeah, they were used to the warmer weather of Jamaica and they were just like they were not happy.
But on your point of kind of granting freedom, I want to pick up on that, because I think, to me, this whole story tells us a lot about how we're taught history and the general narratives that we're kind of, that we're grown up to believe. And I think one of them is definitely that, you know, the British granted freedom as a result of a kind of a change of heart. You know, they suddenly felt like slavery was too cruel, too humane, and they, you know, decided to abolish it. But I think what this story tells us is that there was, you know, that freedom was hard won by rebellions by enslaved people, that there were constant challenges by brave, fierce, formidable, you know, communities. And it wasn't as simple as kind of the British graciously bestowing freedom. You know, first you can see the treaties that they were made to sign, and then, you know, and then you learn, like what you just told me, which is that people learned about the cruelty of slavery. They knew it. People always knew it. It wasn't always just a case of it was fine at the time, which is something I'm really trying to kind of push back against. And then another story that kind of supports this, which isn't part of Jamaican history, but it's part of the Maroon history, which is that the Maroons in Haiti actually really preceded the Haitian Revolution of 1791. The Haitian Revolution was this incredible enslaved people led rebellion against the French colonists in Haiti, which really secured their freedom. And the language they used of rights, freedom, dignity, it totally challenges how we're taught to learn about the history of human rights. We're taught that human rights starts with the American Declaration and the French Declaration and ends in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But this, in Haiti, the enslaved people themselves, challenged the system of enslavement without any of that European thought. But it's kind of unthinkable in Enlightenment terms. And so when I think about the history of everyone else, to me, it's not just kind of plugging gaps in our knowledge. It's not just learning stories that we haven't learned. There's also a process of unlearning the narratives, unlearning the ways we think about history and who was brave and who thought of human rights first and who gave freedom to who, in order to kind of have a broader understanding of the experiences of everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I guess on that point as well about just like unlearning, but also learning, I think for me, I really wanted to actually spend some time learning about Jamaican history and the history of the Caribbean. And what was strange for me, I think growing up, I knew I had like Jamaican heritage, but it took me, I would say, a huge amount of time to link that to slavery and to link that to understanding that if you're Jamaican, then you actually are descendants of people who were from West Africa or other parts of Africa. This link was never made for me, really, until I really started learning. I went to Ghana and started going to these slave castles, of what they're called, where you get to see where people were held before they got sent over to Jamaica, if they made it, if they weren't killed at sea, if they weren't killed, died in the dungeons. But what I loved learning about the Maroons is how much, obviously, they were started from people, often from the kind of Ghanaian region, or it wasn't called Ghana at that time, but the region where there was the Ashanti tribes, Bantu tribes, Akan tribes, and they were those people just now in Jamaica and their descendants, and they've kept a lot of their language. And so what's really fun, if you kind of put in YouTube the Maroons, there's a few documentaries of present day Maroons, so people who know that they are descended from these original Maroons. And you can see on the comments all of these people from Ghana being like, wow, it's really weird to watch this because they're saying these Ghanaian words and they feel really Ghanaian, or they feel like they're just us but from a different country. And I think the Maroons have done a really good job up to present day of preserving a lot of their culture from the people who came. And I think this kind of talks, I think, Meera, one of the last things you wanted to talk about was like these everyday acts of resistance. So obviously there's the big fighting, there's the 2 Maroon Wars, but there's also the like passing down of a name, or making sure that even if everything has been stripped from you from like British enslavement, you pass down your rituals of how you look after your baby. So yeah, I don't know if you have any final points to say on this.
I think you've made that really well. But yes, there is this concept that I've learned about called fugitivity. And it comes from that word fugitive, of the idea of running away and fleeing from captivity. But it now kind of is used to describe these everyday acts of resistance, these everyday acts of refusal. And I think, it kind of resonated with me, and I think it might, resonate with these guys watching, because I think in many ways, a lot of us edit ourselves to kind of fit in different ways. It might be if you're a woman and you fit into more masculine kind of structures. It might be as a person of color, as a gay person, or as anything that just kind of you feel like you can't be your full self and you feel you need to edit yourself in one way or another. And this idea of fugitivity is an extremely kind of positive, powerful way of just refusing to kind of edit, refusing the shame, you know, refusing to do that in small ways, just by being joyful, by being creative, by passing down those family traditions, by asking your family about their history and that being important to you. So yeah, I like that idea of fugitivity, and maybe that's something we can all take away.
Nice. Well, we promised that we'd be half an hour. The time goes so quickly.
I know.
I hope, as you can see, like we're quite nerdy and we've gone like deep into Maroons. So I hope that like this has made sense to people. But like, you know, we're always accessible if you want to ask us more questions, and we might just make a little doc with some of the interesting readings and videos. I would also massively recommend The Long Song. It's a fictional book by Andrea Levy. It's set in Jamaica around this time. I've started listening to a podcast called 1619, which is about slavery in America, and it's a really interesting historical podcast. But yeah, we will put these links and ideas on, and we would love your feedback. We would also love to hear any other parts of history that you want us to research and talk about, and any feedback on how you think this can go forward.
I would love our next one. I would just love our next History of Everyone Else Facebook Live to be about Rhianna, your project on the Niger wives. It's this, Rhianna started this incredible oral history project collecting the stories of this community of Niger wives. And to me, it kind of fits exactly into our History of Everyone Else idea. And Niger wives are women who marry Nigerian men and migrate to Nigeria. So it's kind of this stories of migration that we don't really hear, but we will think about it. But thank you, Meera. It's been really fun to research with you. Thank you to everyone who's watched this. Thank you all for listening and watching, and have a really nice rest of your Sunday.
Have a nice Sunday.
Bye guys.